Welcome back to Sleepy Historian. Tonight, as the day settles behind you and the world grows a little quieter, you are invited to leave behind modern schedules, glowing screens, and endless choices. For a while you can let those things drift into the distance. Find a comfortable position. Allow your shoulders to loosen. Let your breathing settle into a slow and natural rhythm. There is nowhere to hurry, nothing to solve, nothing to finish. Instead, you will spend some time wandering through a medieval world that moved at a different pace, a world where many decisions had already been made long before a person woke up in the morning. And perhaps the most surprising part is this: many of the choices that shaped an ordinary medieval life were not really experienced as choices at all. They felt as natural as sunrise, as familiar as the changing seasons, as unquestioned as the sound of the church bell echoing across the fields. You may even find yourself quietly wondering, as we continue tonight, how many of your own daily habits began in much the same way, followed for so long that their original reason has almost disappeared. The answer may be closer than it first appears. Now, before we continue, if you enjoy these long, peaceful journeys into the quieter corners of history, you can always leave a like for the video. Many listeners return here night after night, letting these slow stories become part of their evening routine. And whenever you feel like wandering through another forgotten century, Sleepy Historian will be here waiting. Now, tonight's story begins with a surprising truth. Many medieval people followed traditions they could not fully explain. A farmer might plant on a certain day because his father had planted on that day. His father had done the same because his own father had done it before him. Somewhere far back in time, there may once have been a practical reason. Perhaps weather patterns had influenced the custom. Perhaps local experience had shaped it. Perhaps a priest had encouraged it. Perhaps nobody remembered. Yet the tradition remained. And so the farmer followed it. Not because he had carefully studied evidence, not because he had weighed every option, but because generations had already done the thinking. This can feel strange to modern ears. Today, people are often encouraged to make individual choices. They are told to follow personal preferences, build personal identities, and create personal paths through life. The medieval world worked differently. That does not mean people lacked personalities. It does not mean they lacked dreams, opinions, or desires. But many daily decisions existed inside boundaries that tradition had quietly built. If you were born into a village in the year 1250, countless expectations would already be waiting for you. How fields should be planted, how neighbors should be treated, when marriages should occur, when work should stop, when prayers should be said, how disputes should be settled, how holidays should be celebrated, what signs in nature deserve attention, what warnings should be respected, what behaviors brought approval, and what behaviors brought uncomfortable silence. These expectations rarely appeared as a single written rulebook. In fact, many villagers could not have pointed to one specific source. The customs simply existed, like the road leading to the village, like the church bell sounding across the fields, like the seasons themselves. You learned them because everyone around you already knew them. Imagine waking before dawn in a small medieval settlement. The air is cold, the room is dim. A faint gray light presses gently against the shutters. You hear someone moving nearby, perhaps a parent, perhaps a spouse, perhaps another family member sharing the same crowded space. Outside, the village remains mostly silent. No engines, no electric lights, no distant traffic, only the occasional sound of an animal shifting in its shelter. As you rise from your sleeping place, you are not immediately faced with endless possibilities. You are not deciding among hundreds of career paths. You are not scrolling through thousands of opinions. You are not comparing dozens of competing lifestyles. Instead, your choices exist inside a much narrower frame. The season helps determine your work. The church calendar helps determine your obligations. Family expectations help determine your responsibilities. Village traditions help determine your behavior. Even the weather may influence your plans. This limitation might sound restrictive, and sometimes it was, but there was another side to it. Tradition also reduced uncertainty. In a world where information traveled slowly, uncertainty could feel enormous. There were no weather forecasts, no scientific journals arriving at your door, no search engines, no emergency services, no instant communication. Most people spent their lives within a relatively small area. Knowledge moved gradually. Experience accumulated slowly. Mistakes could carry serious consequences. When uncertainty surrounded nearly everything, tradition offered something valuable. It offered familiarity. It offered continuity. It offered the reassuring sense that others had faced these same problems before. Imagine standing beside a field in early spring. The soil is beginning to soften after winter. The question before you is simple. When should planting begin? Today you might consult forecasts, agricultural reports, soil analyses, and satellite imagery. In the medieval world, such resources did not exist. Instead, people often turned toward inherited knowledge. They remembered local sayings. They observed familiar signs. They listened to older relatives. They followed patterns passed through generations. These customs were not always correct. Sometimes they failed. Sometimes they survived simply because nobody had found a better alternative. Yet they remained powerful because they connected the present to the past. A tradition represented accumulated memory. Not perfect memory, not scientific memory, but memory nonetheless, and this pattern extended far beyond farming. Throughout medieval life, traditions guided countless decisions. When should a journey begin? Which day was favorable for a wedding? When should certain foods be eaten? How should neighbors cooperate during harvest? What actions showed respect? What actions suggested arrogance? How should children learn their place in society? What signs suggested good fortune? What signs hinted at trouble? Again and again, custom stepped forward to provide answers. Not always clear answers, not always logical answers, but answers that people recognized. As the centuries passed, these traditions became woven into everyday life so thoroughly that many individuals stopped noticing them. They became part of the background, part of the landscape, part of the ordinary rhythm of existence. Much like modern habits often pass unnoticed, you may have routines of your own. Perhaps you check the time at certain moments. Perhaps you follow familiar morning rituals. Perhaps you celebrate holidays whose origins you rarely consider. Perhaps you inherit family customs without remembering where they began. The medieval villager was not so different. The scale was different. The setting was different. But the human tendency remained familiar. People often rely upon inherited patterns because inherited patterns reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty was never in short supply during the Middle Ages. Winters could be harsh, harvests could disappoint, illness could arrive unexpectedly, travel could be difficult, information could be incomplete. In such conditions, traditions offered a form of quiet stability, not certainty, never certainty, but stability. As this journey unfolds, you will gradually explore the many ways medieval traditions guided ordinary decisions. You will encounter seasonal customs that shaped work, religious calendars that organized time, family expectations passed through generations, community obligations that strengthened survival, market traditions that influenced trade, small superstitions hidden inside everyday routines, and perhaps most interesting of all, you will see how many people followed customs without constantly questioning them. Not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked curiosity, but because tradition often felt as natural as breathing. When everyone around you follows the same pattern, the pattern becomes difficult to see. Only later, from a distance of centuries, does it become visible. Tonight you will slowly step into that distance. You will walk through villages governed by habits older than memory. You will observe lives shaped by customs that seemed permanent. You will discover invisible rules quietly directing visible actions. And as the hours pass, you may begin to notice something unexpected. The medieval world was filled with traditions, but the modern world is not entirely free of them either. For now, however, there is no need to think too far ahead. The village waits quietly in the darkness. The church bell stands silent. The fields rest beneath the fading traces of winter. and somewhere nearby a medieval family prepares for another day, guided not only by personal choice, but by customs carried carefully across generations. So settle in, let your thoughts drift gently, and together we will begin with one of the strongest forces shaping medieval life: the steady turning of the seasons. If you were to live in a medieval village, one of the first things you might notice is how little attention people paid to clocks. Not because they were careless, not because they disliked schedules, but because the most important schedule was already hanging above them: the sky. Long before mechanical clocks became common, before watches rested in pockets, before digital screens quietly measured every passing second, people learned to organize life according to larger rhythms. The movement of sunlight, the length of shadows, the changing position of stars, the arrival of frost, the appearance of migrating birds, the first buds on trees, the first yellow leaves of autumn. Time was not divided into endless appointments. Instead, it flowed through seasons. And if you lived in a medieval farming community, the seasons often made many of your decisions for you. Imagine yourself waking in late winter. The cold has not completely disappeared. Morning air still bites at exposed skin. The ground remains firm beneath your feet. Patches of frost linger in shaded places. The fields outside the village appear quiet and empty. At first glance, very little seems to be happening, yet beneath the stillness, anticipation is growing. Everyone is waiting for signs, waiting for change, waiting for permission from the land itself. You cannot simply decide that spring has arrived because you wish it to. The earth must agree, and so you watch. You watch the soil, you watch the weather, you watch the behavior of animals, you listen to older villagers discussing subtle changes. A little more warmth in the afternoon, a certain softness beneath the surface of the ground, a particular bird returning after months away. None of these signs alone determine your actions, but together they create a picture, and that picture guides decisions. This waiting can feel strange from a modern perspective. Today, many people expect immediate action. Plans are often made weeks or months in advance. Dates are chosen and recorded. Events proceed according to schedule. But medieval farming life required patience. Nature moved according to its own timetable. You adapted to it, not the other way around. As the days slowly lengthen, village conversations begin changing. People speak more often about fields, about seed, about weather, about possibilities. No one knows exactly what kind of year lies ahead. That uncertainty is always present. A late frost could damage crops. Heavy rains could delay planting. Dry conditions could create problems later. Nobody possesses complete information, and because uncertainty surrounds every season, tradition becomes valuable. Customs offer guidance when certainty is unavailable. You may hear familiar sayings repeated by older villagers. Perhaps they learned them from parents. Perhaps their parents learned them from grandparents. The exact origin no longer matters. The sayings survive because they have become part of the village's memory. Some are practical, others are less reliable. Yet together they help people feel connected to generations that faced the same questions. Should planting begin now, or should it wait another week? The answer often emerges from a blend of observation and tradition. You notice that medieval people rarely separate these two things completely. Experience and custom live side by side. A farmer observes the soil carefully, but he also remembers what previous generations advised. The result is a decision shaped by both present conditions and inherited knowledge. And so spring arrives gradually, not all at once, not with dramatic announcements, just a slow accumulation of small changes. The mornings become slightly softer. The fields become slightly darker as frost retreats. The air carries different scents. Water begins moving more freely through streams and ditches. Life stirs. Work begins. And once work begins, the season establishes a rhythm that is difficult to escape. You rise early. You spend long hours outdoors. You repeat familiar tasks, day after day, week after week. The routine itself becomes part of tradition. People know what spring requires because spring has always required it. There is comfort in this predictability, but there is also pressure, because the season does not wait. If planting is delayed too long, opportunities shrink. If preparation is neglected, consequences may appear months later. The pressure is rarely dramatic. It arrives quietly, one day at a time. A small task postponed, a field left unfinished, a repair delayed. Nothing feels urgent in a single moment. Yet the season continues moving forward, and eventually those small delays accumulate. This is one reason medieval people paid such close attention to seasonal customs. The customs helped organize labor before problems appeared. Everyone generally understood what needed doing and roughly when it should happen. The result was a kind of collective rhythm. As you walk through the village, you notice many households performing similar tasks. Tools are repaired, animals are prepared for work, fields are inspected, seeds are gathered. The community moves together, not perfectly, but noticeably. This shared movement reduces uncertainty. You know what your neighbors are doing because they are responding to the same season, and they know what you are doing for the same reason. Spring gradually gives way to early summer. The landscape changes again. Green spreads across fields. Plants gain height. The village settles into a different rhythm. Now much of the work involves maintenance rather than preparation. Watching, protecting, managing, waiting. There is a great deal of waiting in medieval agriculture. Waiting rarely receives much attention in historical stories, yet waiting occupies a significant portion of life. You plant, then you wait, you hope, then you wait, you abuzz, you above, then you wait, you observe, then you wait. The crops grow according to their own schedule. No amount of wishing accelerates the process, so people learn patience, not necessarily because they enjoy it, but because circumstances demand it. As summer deepens, the days become long. Sunlight stretches across fields. Work often begins early and continues until evening. Fatigue becomes familiar. You feel it in your shoulders, in your hands, in your legs after long hours standing or walking. Yet even this exhaustion carries a seasonal rhythm. People expect it. They know summer requires effort. Tradition prepares them mentally for what lies ahead. Nobody is surprised when work becomes demanding. The season has always demanded labor. And because everyone understands this, the burden feels shared. The same customs that guide planting also shape expectations. You know difficult weeks are coming. You know others are experiencing them too. The harvest season eventually approaches. For many medieval communities, harvest represents one of the most important periods of the year. The pressure now feels slightly heavier, not dramatic, not frantic, just persistent. The crops standing in the fields represent months of work, months of hope, months of uncertainty. The community's future depends heavily upon what happens next, and so harvest traditions become especially important. Families follow established routines. Neighbors assist one another. Work progresses according to familiar patterns. Generations have refined these practices through repetition, not because every tradition is perfect, but because repetition creates reliability. Reliability matters when mistakes carry consequences. Imagine standing at the edge of a field during harvest. The air feels cooler than it did a few weeks ago. The sunlight has changed. The season is turning. Around you, people move steadily through familiar tasks. Their actions often appear ordinary, perhaps even boring. But beneath the ordinary surface lies accumulated experience. Each motion reflects knowledge passed from person to person across decades, sometimes centuries. A tool is held a certain way. A task is performed in a particular order. Work pauses at expected moments. The details vary from place to place, yet the underlying principle remains consistent. Tradition serves as stored memory. It allows communities to benefit from lessons learned long ago. As autumn advances, another shift occurs. The urgency of harvest gradually fades. Fields empty. Days shorten. Temperatures decline. People begin preparing for winter. Again, the season decides much of what happens next. Food must be stored. Repairs must be completed. Supplies must be organized. Animals require attention. The community collectively turns toward colder months. You can almost feel the village settling inward. Activity becomes more concentrated around homes and shared spaces. Evenings grow longer. Darkness arrives earlier. The pace changes. And throughout this entire cycle, from spring planting to winter preparation, tradition acts as a quiet guide. It does not eliminate uncertainty. Storms still come. Harvests still vary. Hardships still Hardships still appear. But customs provide structure, a framework, a familiar path through unfamiliar conditions. Perhaps that is one reason these traditions endured for so long, not because they guaranteed success, but because they offered direction. In a world where certainty was scarce, direction itself held great value. And so, year after year, generation after generation, medieval people often allowed the seasons to decide what happened next. Not because they lacked imagination, not because they lacked ambition, but because the turning of the year remained stronger than individual preference. The land had its own rhythm. The weather had its own schedule. The crops had their own pace. And if you wished to survive, the wisest choice was usually to listen. Slowly, patiently, and with the understanding that countless people before you had listened to the same seasonal voice. If the seasons helped medieval people decide what work needed to be done, the religious calendar often helped them decide when that work should happen. To modern eyes, a calendar usually appears simple. Days arranged in rows, weeks passing one after another, months advancing steadily toward the next year. Most dates seem largely interchangeable. A meeting can happen on Tuesday instead of Wednesday. A trip can begin on the 5th rather than the 6th. The difference often feels minor. For many medieval people, however, not every day felt the same. Certain days carried meanings of their own. Some felt favorable. Some felt solemn. Some felt celebratory. Others seemed unsuitable for particular activities. And because these meanings were shared by entire communities, they quietly influenced countless decisions. Imagine yourself living in a village where the church bell is one of the most reliable markers of time. You do not carry a watch. You do not receive notifications. You do not check an electronic calendar. Instead, much of the year is organized through a cycle of religious observances that everyone around you understands. The names of saints, the arrival of feast days, periods of fasting, holy celebrations, days of remembrance, days of reflection. Together they create a second calendar layered over the ordinary passing of seasons. The fields may tell you what month it is. The church calendar tells you what the day means, and meaning matters very much. A traveler preparing for a journey might consider not only the weather but also the date. A family arranging a wedding might pay close attention to upcoming feast days. A merchant planning a transaction might think about whether an important religious observance is approaching. Life becomes a continuous conversation between practical needs and inherited customs. To understand this world, it helps to imagine how frequently religious observances appeared. Today, many people think mainly of a few major holidays each year. The medieval calendar was often far more crowded. Different regions celebrated different saints. Local churches honored particular traditions. Communities remembered events important to their own history. As a result, the year contained numerous occasions that shaped expectations and routines. Some days encouraged celebration. Others encouraged restraint. Some inspired gathering. Others invited reflection. You might wake one morning expecting an ordinary workday, only to remember that a feast day is approaching. Suddenly the rhythm changes. Preparations begin. Food is organized. Neighbors discuss plans. The atmosphere shifts. Not dramatically, but noticeably. People anticipate a temporary break from routine. And breaks from routine are significant when daily life contains so much repetition. Imagine weeks of steady agricultural labor, early mornings, long hours, familiar tasks. Then, gradually, a feast day approaches. The anticipation itself becomes part of the experience. People have something to look forward to, something that interrupts the sameness, something that reminds them the year contains more than work alone. This is one reason feast days mattered. They provided structure not only for religious devotion but also for emotional life. The calendar created moments of contrast, periods of effort followed by periods of celebration, activity followed by rest, ordinary days followed by special days. The alternation helped people endure long stretches of routine, and routine was a major feature of medieval existence. Yet not all religious days encouraged celebration. Some encouraged caution, some encouraged restraint. There were periods when certain activities seemed inappropriate, periods when communities adopted different behaviors, periods when expectations changed. You might notice fewer festivities, simpler meals, more reflection, a quieter atmosphere. Again, these customs provided structure. The year was not simply moving forward in a straight line. It possessed texture. Different moments carried different meanings. And because everyone shared those meanings, decisions often reflected them. Consider marriage. Today, people frequently choose wedding dates based upon convenience, personal preference, venue availability, or family schedules. Medieval families often thought differently. Certain times of year were considered more suitable than others. Religious observances could influence decisions. Periods associated with fasting or solemnity might discourage weddings. Celebratory seasons might encourage them. The choice was not merely practical, it was cultural. A wedding connected two families, sometimes entire communities. Therefore, the timing mattered. The calendar offered guidance, not always strict rules, but expectations. And expectations can be remarkably powerful, especially when shared by everyone around you. Travel decisions were often influenced in similar ways. Imagine preparing for a journey that may take several days. Roads are imperfect, weather remains uncertain, accommodations are limited, communication is slow. Such journeys require planning. If an important feast day approaches, you might decide to delay departure, or you might travel specifically to participate in a celebration elsewhere. The calendar influences movement. Movement influences opportunity. Opportunity influences daily life. A simple date on the calendar quietly shapes larger outcomes. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout medieval society. Traditions influence small decisions. Small decisions influence larger experiences. The process is gradual, almost invisible, yet deeply significant. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of these customs is how naturally they became woven into ordinary thinking. Many people did not wake each morning consciously analyzing every tradition. They simply lived inside them. The customs felt familiar, expected, normal, much as modern routines often feel normal to us. Imagine a child growing up in such a village. Year after year, the same celebrations arrive, the same observances return, the same feast days appear, the same stories are told, the same expectations are reinforced. Eventually, the calendar becomes part of the child's understanding of reality itself. This is simply how the world works, not because someone constantly explains it, but because everyone participates. Tradition gains strength through repetition. Each year reinforces the previous year. Each generation teaches the next. The result is remarkable continuity. Of course, medieval people were not identical. Individuals differed. Families differed. Regions differed. Some customs vary considerably from place to place, yet the broader pattern remained recognizable. The calendar served as more than a method of tracking days. It became a framework for organizing life. And in a world filled with uncertainty, frameworks offered reassurance. Imagine the arrival of a major feast day after months of demanding work. The village feels different from the moment you wake. There is movement, conversation, preparation. Perhaps special food appears. Perhaps relatives visit. Perhaps people wear better clothing than usual. Perhaps work pauses. The details vary, but the atmosphere changes. The day carries significance, not because of personal preference alone, because tradition says it does, because generations have agreed that this day deserves attention. That agreement creates collective meaning, and collective meaning is powerful. It transforms ordinary dates into shared experiences. It allows entire communities to move together through time, not merely measuring days, experiencing them. Yet alongside celebration existed another category of days. Days approached with caution, days that inspired hesitation, days associated with certain beliefs or warnings. Some communities considered particular dates unlucky. Others avoided beginning important tasks during specific periods. The reasons varied, sometimes religious, sometimes cultural, sometimes difficult to trace, but the effect was real. People adjusted behavior accordingly. You may find this irrational, or perhaps familiar. Even today, people often prefer certain dates over others. They postpone decisions, seek favorable timing, avoid moments that feel wrong. Human beings frequently attach meaning to time. The medieval world simply did so more openly. As evening settles over the village, the church bell sounds once more. The day gradually closes. Families gather. Candles flicker. Conversations slow. Tomorrow will bring another set of responsibilities, another collection of choices, yet many of those choices will continue to be shaped by the calendar, not because the calendar possesses magical power, but because generations have invested it with meaning accumulated slowly, year after year, century after century, until entire communities learn to navigate life according to rhythms larger than themselves. The seasons guided work. The religious calendar guided time. Together they formed an invisible structure supporting daily decisions, a structure so familiar that most people hardly noticed it, and perhaps that is the true strength of tradition. When it becomes deeply woven into everyday life, it no longer feels like guidance. It simply feels like the way things are. Long before weather forecasts appeared on screens, long before satellites watched clouds drifting across continents, and long before scientific instruments measured atmospheric changes with remarkable precision, people still needed to make decisions. Fields still needed planting, journeys still needed planning, animals still required care. Families still needed food. The challenge was that the future remained difficult to see. A clear morning could become a stormy afternoon. A promising spring could be followed by a disappointing summer. A mild autumn could suddenly give way to an early winter. And because uncertainty touched nearly every part of life, medieval people became careful observers of the natural world around them. If you lived in a medieval village, you might spend more time looking at the sky than many people do today. Not because you were especially interested in clouds, but because the sky affected your survival. You would notice the color of dawn, the shape of approaching clouds, the direction of the wind, the feel of the air against your skin. You might pay attention to details that modern people often overlook. The way smoke rises from a chimney, the sound of distant birds, the appearance of dew in the morning, the movement of insects before rain. Each observation felt like a small piece of a larger puzzle. No single sign revealed the future, yet together they offered clues, and over generations communities developed traditions based upon these clues. Some traditions reflected genuine experience, others reflected coincidence. Many combined practical observation with folklore. The boundary between the two was often difficult to identify. Imagine waking before sunrise on a cool spring morning. The village remains quiet. A thin layer of mist hangs over nearby fields. You step outside and immediately notice something unusual. The air feels heavier than yesterday. Birdsong seems quieter. The sky possesses a faint grayness that was absent the day before. None of these observations prove anything, yet older villagers may begin discussing them. A change may be coming. Perhaps rain, perhaps wind, perhaps colder temperatures. Nobody knows for certain, but people start paying attention. This habit of attention became one of the most valuable survival skills in medieval life. When information is scarce, observation becomes important. You learn to notice patterns. You compare present conditions with remembered experiences. You listen to those who have witnessed many seasons. Tradition often grows from this process. A grandmother remembers weather linked to a certain flowering plant. A farmer recalls years when migrating birds arrived unusually early. A shepherd notices recurring relationships between animal behavior and changing conditions. Over time, these observations become stories. The stories become sayings. The sayings become traditions. And eventually people inherit them as wisdom. Whether every tradition is accurate matters less than understanding why it exists. Most customs begin as attempts to reduce uncertainty. People seek guidance. They seek patterns. They seek ways to make tomorrow slightly more predictable than it feels today. Imagine standing beside a village field while dark clouds gather on the horizon. You are not checking a forecast. You are watching, waiting, interpreting. Perhaps someone nearby mentions an old saying passed through generations. Perhaps another person remembers a similar sky from years ago. The conversation itself becomes part of the decision-making process. Should work continue? Should animals be moved? Should tools be brought indoors? The answers emerge through a mixture of observation and inherited belief. This combination appears throughout medieval life. People rarely relied solely upon tradition, nor did they rely solely upon direct observation. Instead, they blended the two. Tradition helped interpret what they observed. Observation helped reinforce tradition. Together they formed a practical system for navigating uncertainty. Animals often occupied an important place within this system. If you spend much of your life outdoors, surrounded by livestock and wildlife, you naturally begin noticing their behavior. You notice when birds gather differently, when sheep appear restless, when cattle seek shelter, when insects seem unusually active. Many medieval people believed animals sensed environmental changes before humans did. Modern science sometimes supports portions of this idea. Animals often do respond to atmospheric shifts. Yet medieval interpretations extended beyond strict observation. Animal behavior could become symbolic, meaning accumulated around it. Stories developed, traditions followed. Imagine a group of villagers observing swallows flying unusually low over fields. Someone recalls hearing that such behavior often precedes rain. Another agrees. A third remembers previous occasions when the same pattern appeared. Soon the observation gains weight. Whether the prediction proves correct or not, the tradition survives because people remember the times it seems successful. Human memory often works this way. We remember meaningful patterns. We repeat memorable stories. We pass them forward. The result is a living collection of beliefs linking nature and human experience. Weather itself became filled with meaning. An unexpected storm might inspire discussion for weeks. A particularly harsh winter could enter local memory for decades. An unusually warm season might become a reference point for future generations. People naturally searched for explanations. Why had this happened? What signs appeared beforehand? Could it have been anticipated? Tradition often provided answers, not always accurate answers, but answers nonetheless. And answers can feel comforting when circumstances are difficult. Imagine a long winter settling over the village. The days shorten. Darkness arrives early. Cold air presses against walls and shutters. Snow covers fields. Travel becomes more difficult. Food stores receive closer attention. You spend more time indoors. During these months, stories become especially valuable. Families gather near firelight. Conversations drift toward memories. People recall previous winters, previous hardships, previous recoveries. Knowledge moves from one generation to another, not through textbooks, not through formal lectures, but through storytelling. This is how many traditions survive. One evening, someone mentions a weather sign remembered from childhood. Another person adds details. A third corrects part of the story. The discussion continues. Years later, a child who listened quietly by the fire may repeat the same tradition. The cycle continues. Knowledge becomes culture. Culture becomes expectation. Expectation influences decisions. And decisions shape daily life. There is something deeply human about this process. People have always sought meaning in the world around them. They notice patterns. They create explanations. They share them with others. The medieval world simply relied upon this process more openly because alternative sources of information were limited. You may begin noticing that many medieval traditions functioned less like rigid rules and more like tools. Not perfect tools, not infallible tools, but useful ones. A weather saying might encourage caution. A seasonal belief might encourage preparation. An animal observation might prompt attention. Even when predictions failed, the traditions often encouraged awareness. And awareness itself held value. Imagine walking through fields during late summer. The crops sway gently in the breeze. The sky stretches overhead. Nothing appears unusual. Yet experienced villagers continue watching, listening, comparing. They understand that conditions can change. They understand that success depends partly upon recognizing those changes. Tradition sharpens observation. Observation reinforces tradition. The relationship continues year after year. Perhaps this explains why so many weather-related customs survived for centuries. People did not preserve them merely because they enjoyed old stories. They preserved them because uncertainty remained a constant companion. The future always contained unknowns, and any system that offered guidance felt worthwhile, even if imperfect. Even if incomplete. As evening approaches, shadows lengthen across the landscape. The village grows quieter. Smoke rises from chimneys. Animals settle. Families return indoors. Another day of observation comes to an end. Tomorrow the weather may change, or it may remain exactly the same. Nobody can know for certain, but people will continue watching. They will continue remembering. They will continue sharing traditions passed down through generations. Not because tradition eliminates uncertainty, because it helps people live alongside it. And in the medieval world, living alongside uncertainty was one of the most important skills a person could possess. The sky could not be controlled. The seasons could not be controlled. The weather could not be controlled. Yet through observation, memory, and tradition, people found ways to navigate these forces. Slowly, patiently. One sign at a time. One season at a time. One generation at a time. If the seasons guided your work and the calendar guided your time, there was another force that quietly shaped your life long before you took your first breath. Your family. In the modern world, people often imagine life as a series of personal choices. A person chooses a career, chooses where to live, chooses friends, chooses goals, chooses an identity. Of course, reality is always more complicated than that. Yet compared to medieval life, modern people often possess a remarkable degree of flexibility. In a medieval village, many of the most important decisions had already begun taking shape before you were born. Not because anyone wished to limit your future, but because survival depended upon continuity. Families were not merely collections of relatives living under the same roof. They were economic units, work units, support networks, sources of protection, sources of knowledge. In many cases, the family itself was the foundation upon which daily life rested. Imagine arriving in a medieval village as a newborn child. You know nothing of the world around you. You do not understand the fields beyond the cottages. You do not understand the church bell ringing across the landscape. You do not understand the expectations waiting quietly in the future. Yet those expectations already exist. The family into which you are born immediately shapes your path. If your parents farm, you will likely learn farming. If your family practices a craft, you will probably learn that craft. If your household possesses certain responsibilities within the community, those responsibilities may eventually become yours. None of this is guaranteed. Lives can change. Circumstances can shift. Unexpected opportunities sometimes appear. Yet tradition tends to favor continuity. People often trust what is familiar, and few things feel more familiar than family knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Imagine yourself as a young child in a village household. The day begins before sunrise. Adults are already awake. Tasks are already underway. Animals require attention. Food must be prepared. Tools must be maintained. The household operates according to routines established long before your arrival. At first, you simply observe. You watch older family members work. You listen to conversations. You absorb habits without realizing it. No formal lesson is necessary. Learning happens naturally, gradually, through repetition. You notice where tools are stored. You notice how tasks are performed. You notice which jobs belong to which people. The details become familiar long before anyone expects you to perform them yourself. This process might continue for years. A child growing up in medieval society often learned by participation rather than instruction alone. You help where you can. You imitate what you see. You make mistakes. You try again. Little by little, the customs of the household become part of your own behavior. One day, without fully realizing when the change occurred, you begin performing tasks that once seemed far beyond your abilities. The transition feels natural because it happens slowly. Tradition often works this way. It rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it settles gently into everyday life until it becomes difficult to imagine another way of doing things. As you grow older, family expectations become clearer. Some are spoken aloud, others remain unspoken. Perhaps everyone assumes you will eventually continue a certain occupation. Perhaps relatives expect you to help care for aging family members. Perhaps certain responsibilities have passed through generations. The expectations are not always enforced through strict commands. Sometimes they exist simply because everyone assumes they are reasonable, and assumptions can be powerful. When a custom has existed for decades, questioning it may not even occur to most people, not because they lack imagination, because the custom feels natural. Imagine standing beside your father in a field, or beside your mother at a workbench, or beside an older relative tending animals. You are not merely learning a skill, you are inheriting a way of life, a collection of habits, a set of practical solutions refined through years of experience. The family serves as a living archive. Knowledge is stored not in books but in people. One generation teaches the next generation continues the process. The chain remains unbroken. This transfer of knowledge becomes especially important in a world where formal education is limited for many people. Practical experience matters enormously. How deep should seeds be planted? How should a roof be repaired? When should animals be moved? How should food be stored for winter? What signs suggest illness in livestock? What weather patterns deserve concern? These lessons often come from family, and because they come from family, they carry authority. The advice has survived because previous generations found it useful, at least useful enough to preserve. You may begin noticing that medieval traditions frequently revolve around trust. People trust customs because those customs connect them to familiar sources of knowledge. Family occupies a central place within that network of trust. When uncertainty appears, people often turn toward those who possess experience, and experience usually begins at home. Many medieval households included multiple generations living together or nearby: grandparents, parents, children, sometimes extended relatives as well. This arrangement created opportunities for constant learning. Stories passed from older voices to younger ears. Memories remained accessible. Lessons survived. Imagine an evening during winter. Outside, cold winds move across dark fields. Inside, firelight flickers against stone or timber walls. Several generations share the same space. The younger members listen while older relatives discuss past harvests, past winters, past challenges, past recoveries. The conversation is not necessarily formal. No one announces that wisdom is being transmitted. Yet wisdom moves quietly through the room all the same. A child listening near the hearth may remember those stories decades later, and eventually repeat them to another generation. Tradition survives because people carry it forward. One conversation at a time. One memory at a time. One household at a time. Of course, family expectations could sometimes feel restrictive. Not every individual wanted exactly the future others imagined. Not every child dreamed of continuing the same work. Human beings have always possessed personal ambitions and private hopes. Medieval people were no exception. Yet opportunities for dramatic change were often limited. Geography imposed constraints. Economics imposed constraints. Social expectations imposed constraints. Family traditions added another layer. Again, this does not mean medieval people lacked freedom entirely. Life always contains choices, but the range of available choices often differed from what modern people experience. Imagine a river flowing between high banks. The water can move in many directions within the channel, Yet the channel itself guides the flow. Family tradition often worked in a similar way. You could make decisions, but those decisions frequently occurred within boundaries established by generations before you. Interestingly, many people likely found comfort in these boundaries. Today, endless choices can sometimes feel overwhelming. Modern life often requires individuals to construct personal paths through enormous uncertainty. Medieval people faced different challenges. They possessed fewer options in some respects, yet they also inherited clearer expectations. The path ahead might not be easy, but it was often visible. You knew what previous generations had done. You knew what the community expected. You knew which responsibilities would likely become yours. This predictability reduced certain forms of anxiety. It provided direction. Direction was valuable, especially in a world where so many other things remained uncertain. As years passed, you eventually became one of the older members of the household. The lessons you once received became lessons you shared. The customs you once inherited became customs you preserved. Without necessarily intending to, you joined the chain. The same traditions that shaped your childhood now influence younger generations. The process continues, steady, quiet, remarkably durable, and perhaps that is one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval family life. Many decisions were not made by individuals acting alone. They emerged from long histories stretching backward through parents, grandparents, and ancestors whose names may already have been forgotten. Their influence remained nonetheless, present in routines, present in expectations, present in habits repeated every day, long after individual lives had ended. In this way, family tradition became more than memory. It became a guide, an invisible inheritance accompanying people through ordinary life, a set of directions written not on paper but within households themselves. And for countless medieval men and women, those directions quietly shaped the future before the future ever arrived. If family traditions shaped the beginning of your life, they also played a powerful role in determining with whom you would share the rest of it. In the modern world, marriage is often viewed as a deeply personal decision. People may spend years getting to know one another. They may choose partners based on affection, shared interests, personal goals, or individual compatibility. While love certainly existed in the medieval world, marriage often carried meanings that extended far beyond the feelings of two individuals. A marriage connected families. It connected households. Sometimes it connected land, resources, obligations, and long-standing relationships. And because the consequences affected many people, communities frequently took an interest in the process. Imagine yourself as a young adult in a medieval village. The seasons continue their steady cycle. The church bells continue marking important moments. The routines of work continue much as they always have. Yet gradually, another expectation begins to emerge. Questions about marriage, questions about the future, questions about where your place within the wider community will eventually be. Unlike many modern societies, medieval villages were often relatively small. People knew one another. They knew family histories. They knew reputations. They remembered old disputes and old friendships. Information traveled not through newspapers or social media, but through conversation. A great deal of conversation. This meant that few major life decisions remained entirely private. Marriage certainly did not. If a young man showed interest in a young woman, people often noticed. If two families appeared to be growing closer, neighbors might discuss it. If a possible match seemed especially suitable, or especially questionable opinions, often formed long before any official announcement occurred. This constant awareness was not necessarily driven by curiosity alone. Marriage affected the entire social fabric of a village. A successful union could strengthen relationships between households. An unstable one could create tensions that lasted for years. Because communities depended heavily upon cooperation, stability mattered, and stability encouraged involvement. Imagine walking through a village during late spring. The air feels mild. The fields are alive with growth. People work outdoors for long hours. Opportunities for interaction naturally increase. You pass neighbors. You help with shared tasks. You attend religious observances. You participate in seasonal celebrations. These gatherings create spaces where relationships form and develop. Courtship, where it existed, often unfolded within public settings rather than complete privacy. Many interactions occurred under the watchful eyes of relatives, neighbors, or community members, not because romance was forbidden, but because social life itself was communal. The village observed, the village remembered, and the village formed opinions. Reputation became extremely important. Today, people can often move between different social groups. If one community views them negatively, they may find acceptance elsewhere. Medieval villagers frequently had fewer alternatives. A person's reputation could influence opportunities, trust, cooperation, and future relationships. As a result, behavior carried significance. Families cared deeply about how they were perceived. Tradition offered guidance regarding proper conduct. Young people learned expectations early. How should one behave during social gatherings? How should respect be shown? What actions might encourage approval? What actions might invite criticism? The answers varied from place to place, yet the broader principle remained consistent. Marriage existed within a framework of community expectations. Imagine an evening gathering after a day of work. Perhaps there is music. Perhaps there is dancing. Perhaps there are stories being shared near a fire. The atmosphere is relaxed. Yet even in relaxed moments, traditions remain present. People observe one another, not with hostility, not necessarily with judgment, but with attention. The community functions partly through observation. Everyone understands this. The result is a social environment where customs help guide behavior. Over time, families often played active roles in marriage discussions. This did not always mean formal arrangements imposed without consent. Medieval experiences varied considerably across regions and social classes. However, family involvement was frequently significant. Parents considered practical questions. Could the couple support a household? Would the union strengthen existing relationships? Did both families possess compatible expectations? Would resources be sufficient? Such concerns may sound unromantic, yet they reflected the realities of survival. Marriage created a new household. A household required food, shelter, labor, and stability. Practical considerations could not easily be ignored. Imagine two families discussing a potential marriage. The conversation unfolds gradually. No dramatic negotiations. No sudden decisions. Instead, there is careful consideration, questions, observations, discussions about responsibilities and future plans. The process reflects a broader medieval tendency toward caution. Major decisions often develop slowly. Tradition encouraged patience. A stable arrangement was generally preferred over a rushed one. This preference for stability appeared in the timing of marriages as well. Many communities developed customs regarding when weddings should occur. Certain seasons proved more popular than others. Agricultural demands influenced schedules. Religious calendars influenced schedules. Community traditions influenced schedules. The result was a pattern in which marriages often clustered around particular times of year. Imagine a village wedding during autumn. The harvest is largely complete. Food supplies are relatively abundant. The most intense agricultural labor has eased. People have more opportunity to gather. The timing feels practical. Yet it also feels traditional. Generations have celebrated weddings during similar seasons. The custom reinforces itself through repetition. One year resembles the previous year. The previous year resembles the one before that. Tradition accumulates quietly. Weddings themselves often reflected community participation. Again, the details varied across regions. But marriage was rarely an event involving only two people. Relatives attended, neighbors attended, community members participated. The gathering publicly acknowledged a new social reality. Two individuals were joining their lives. But two families were also strengthening connections. The community witnessed the transition together. This public dimension served an important purpose. Medieval society depended heavily upon shared understanding. Public ceremonies clarified expectations. They reduced uncertainty. They signaled new responsibilities and new relationships. Everyone knew where they stood. This clarity helped maintain social stability. and social stability was precious, especially in environments where cooperation remained essential for survival. Yet even after marriage, traditions continued guiding daily life. New households inherited familiar routines. Roles and responsibilities often reflected long-established customs. Skills passed from parents to children. Expectations moved from one generation to the next. The newly married couple stepped into patterns shaped by centuries of experience, not identical patterns. Every household possessed its own character. Every relationship developed differently, yet tradition provided a framework, a starting point, a collection of assumptions about how life should proceed. You may begin noticing a recurring theme throughout medieval history. Traditions often functioned as tools for reducing uncertainty. Marriage offers another example. The future always remained unpredictable. No one could guarantee happiness. No one could guarantee prosperity. No one could guarantee health or success. But customs offered guidance. They suggested ways of navigating important transitions. They provided familiar procedures. And familiar procedures can feel reassuring when entering unfamiliar stages of life. Imagine a newly married couple settling into their first winter together. Outside, cold winds move across dark fields. Inside, firelight flickers softly. The future remains uncertain. Yet much of daily life already possesses structure. Meals follow familiar patterns. Work follows familiar patterns. Community relationships follow familiar patterns. Tradition cannot eliminate every difficulty, but it can offer direction. And direction often matters more than certainty. As years pass, the couple eventually becomes part of the community's older generation. Young people begin looking toward them. The customs they inherited become customs they preserve. The advice they once received becomes advice they share. The cycle continues. Marriage is not merely a personal milestone. It becomes another mechanism through which traditions survive. One household joins another. One generation teaches the next. One set of customs blends with another. And through this slow, continuous process, medieval communities maintain remarkable continuity across centuries, not because every person thinks alike, not because every marriage unfolds the same way, but because tradition provides a common language through which people navigate life's most important decisions. A language spoken quietly, repeated patiently, and passed forward long after the individuals themselves are gone. If family helped determine where you belonged, your neighbors often helped determine how well you survived. Modern life can sometimes create the impression that independence is the ideal condition. Many people value self-sufficiency. They appreciate privacy. They take pride in solving problems on their own. Medieval villagers certainly valued competence and responsibility, yet complete independence was often neither practical nor realistic. Life contained too many uncertainties. A roof might need repairing. A harvest might require extra hands. An illness might temporarily remove someone from work. A winter storm might damage property. A family could suddenly find itself facing challenges too large to manage alone. And because such situations were common, medieval communities developed traditions that encouraged cooperation. Not constant cooperation, not perfect cooperation, but enough cooperation to strengthen collective survival. Imagine yourself standing in a small village on an early autumn morning. Mist drifts slowly across nearby fields. The air carries the scent of damp earth and harvested grain. Around you, people are already moving through familiar routines. Animals are being fed. Tools are being gathered. Work is beginning. At first glance, each household appears occupied with its own concerns. Yet beneath the surface, connections exist everywhere. Families exchange labor. Neighbors share information. Communities coordinate efforts. Tradition helps maintain these relationships. Many of these customs are so ordinary that people barely notice them. That is often how powerful traditions work. They become part of the landscape of everyday life. Imagine a farmer whose harvest must be completed before incoming weather causes damage. The task is larger than one family can comfortably handle. Neighbors arrive to assist. Perhaps not because a formal contract requires it. Perhaps not because payment is immediately expected, but because helping is part of the community's established pattern. The assistance may be returned later, or perhaps it was returned years ago. The exact balance is often less important than the existence of the relationship itself. Everyone understands the principle. Today you help. Tomorrow someone helps you. This exchange creates resilience. A single household may struggle. A network of households can endure much more. The tradition survives because people repeatedly experience its value. Imagine spending an entire day helping gather a neighbor's harvest. The work is repetitive. The hours are long. The physical effort is real. Yet there is also conversation, shared experience, familiar company. People work side by side. Stories are exchanged. News travels. Relationships strengthen. The labor accomplishes more than its immediate purpose. It reinforces social bonds. And social bonds matter. In a world without modern safety nets, trusted relationships often provide the first response to difficulty. You begin noticing that medieval customs frequently blur the line between practical necessity and social expectation. Helping a neighbor serves a practical purpose. The crops must be gathered. The roof must be repaired. The wood must be cut. Yet helping also communicates something. It signals membership, trustworthiness, commitment to the community. Participation becomes a way of affirming belonging. Imagine choosing not to help when everyone else participates. Perhaps you have a legitimate reason. Perhaps you are ill. Perhaps your own responsibilities demand attention. People will likely understand. But if someone repeatedly refuses communal obligations without explanation, others begin noticing. Not immediately, not dramatically, just gradually. Reputation shifts. Trust weakens. Questions arise. Again, medieval social pressure often operates quietly, rarely through confrontation, more often through observation and memory. People remember who contributes. They remember who can be relied upon. And because cooperation is valuable, reliability becomes an admired quality. This dynamic appears throughout village life. Imagine a family facing illness during winter. The situation may not be catastrophic, yet ordinary tasks suddenly become more difficult. Animals still need care. Fuel still needs gathering. Fuel still requires preparation. Neighbors may step forward to assist. A few extra hands, a few small favors, a few practical acts of support. Individually, these actions seem modest. Collectively, they can make a tremendous difference. Tradition encourages such behavior because communities understand its importance. Anyone might need help eventually. Helping others becomes an investment in future security, not necessarily calculated security. Human relationships are rarely that precise, but security nonetheless. You support the community partly because the community supports you. This principle extends beyond emergencies. Many medieval villages organized shared responsibilities through long-established customs. Certain tasks affected everyone: road maintenance, boundary disputes, management of common resources, seasonal obligations. The details varied widely across regions, yet communal participation remained common. Imagine villagers gathering to discuss repairs after a difficult winter. A bridge requires attention. A path has become difficult to use. Drainage channels need clearing. No single household benefits alone. The work serves the wider community, and because the benefit is shared, the responsibility is shared as well. Tradition helps define who participates and how. Without such customs, cooperation becomes more difficult to coordinate. Traditions simplify the process. Everyone generally knows what is expected. Expectations reduce uncertainty. Once again, the familiar pattern appears. Throughout medieval life, customs frequently function as tools for organizing collective behavior. You may also notice how many of these traditions involve repetition. People help with harvests year after year. They participate in communal repairs year after year. They attend gatherings year after year. The repetition itself strengthens the custom. Children grow up watching adults cooperate. Eventually, they participate themselves. What begins as observation becomes habit. What becomes habit eventually feels natural. Imagine a young child accompanying parents during a communal workday. The child may contribute little, perhaps carrying small items, perhaps observing more than helping. yet important lessons are already being learned. The child sees how neighbors interact. The child sees expectations in action. The child sees that participation matters. Years later, those observations may shape behavior without conscious reflection. Tradition often works through exposure rather than instruction. People absorb customs because they live among them. One particularly interesting aspect of neighborly obligation is that it combines generosity with practicality. Helping others may appear purely selfless. Yet communities also understand that mutual assistance benefits everyone. The two motivations coexist. People genuinely care about one another. People also recognize that cooperation improves collective survival. There is no contradiction. Human societies frequently operate through both compassion and practicality at the same time. Imagine a severe winter settling over the countryside. Snow covers roads. Travel becomes difficult. Resources require careful management. Under such conditions, isolated households face greater risks. Connected households possess advantages. Information moves more easily. Assistance becomes available. Problems are addressed collectively. Traditions of cooperation reveal their value most clearly during difficult periods. Yet they are built during ordinary periods. This is perhaps their greatest strength. Communities do not wait for emergencies before forming relationships. The relationships already exist. The habits already exist. The expectations already exist. When hardship arrives, the framework is ready. As evening falls over the village, work gradually comes to an end. Tools are stored. Animals are settled. Families return home. Smoke rises from chimneys into the cooling air. The day's labor is complete, yet beneath the visible tasks lies something equally important. The quiet maintenance of trust. Trust between neighbors. Trust between households. Trust between generations. Tradition helps maintain that trust, not through grand declarations, not through formal systems, but through repeated actions performed over years and decades. A helping hand offered during harvest, assistance during illness, participation in communal work, presence during important moments. These small acts accumulate. Together they create a network strong enough to support ordinary life. And ordinary life, after all, occupies most of human history. The great events recorded in chronicles and histories are important. But survival often depends upon quieter things. Reliable neighbors, shared expectations, mutual obligations, traditions that encourage cooperation. For many medieval villagers, these customs were not merely social habits. They were practical survival tools, invisible threads connecting households together, threads strengthened through repetition, maintained through trust, and passed forward from one generation to the next. By now you may have begun to notice a pattern running quietly through medieval life. Traditions were not only used for holidays. They were not only used for marriage. They were not only used for organizing communities. They also shaped something that occupied a great deal of every ordinary day: work. For many medieval people, work was not merely a source of income. It was the structure around which life itself was built. The seasons influenced it. The family passed it down. The community depended upon it. And because survival often relied upon consistent results rather than experimentation, people frequently worked in ways that had already been proven by previous generations. Imagine waking before dawn in a small village. The darkness still lingers outside. The air inside your home feels cool. A faint orange glow from the hearth provides the only light. You rise slowly. Others in the household are already awake. No one asks what kind of work will happen today. That question has usually been answered already. The season knows. The family knows. The community knows. The tasks waiting outside are familiar. Perhaps fields require attention. Perhaps animals require care. Perhaps tools require repair. Whatever the work may be, it follows patterns repeated many times before. You are not beginning from nothing. You are continuing something. And in many ways, medieval labor was built upon continuity. Imagine a farmer carrying a wooden tool into a field. The tool may not be identical to the one used by his grandfather. Small changes occur over time. Materials improve. Local techniques evolve. yet the basic principles remain recognizable. The grandfather would understand what is happening. The father understands it. The son understands it. Knowledge passes through generations like water flowing along a familiar channel. This continuity creates stability. People know what to expect. They know which methods usually succeed. They know which mistakes should be avoided. Tradition becomes a kind of accumulated experience stored within the community. You might think of it as a library without books. The knowledge exists. It is simply carried by people instead of pages. Imagine spending years learning a craft. Perhaps you are working with wood, perhaps leather, perhaps cloth, perhaps metal. The specific trade matters less than the process itself. You do not begin by inventing entirely new methods. Instead, you learn established techniques. You watch experienced workers. You imitate their actions. You repeat tasks until they become familiar. At first, this may seem restrictive. Why not constantly experiment? Why not change everything? The answer often comes back to risk. Risk feels different when survival is uncertain. Today, if a new method fails, the consequences may be limited. In the medieval world, failure could be more costly. A ruined harvest matters. A poorly built tool matters. A damaged roof matters. Mistakes carry weight. As a result, proven methods earn trust. And trust is valuable. Imagine a craft workshop late in the afternoon. Light enters through a small opening. Dust floats gently in the air. Tools rest in familiar places. The work proceeds according to routines developed over many years. Nothing appears especially dramatic. In fact, much of it seems repetitive. The same movements, the same materials, the same sequence of steps, day after day, week after week. Yet repetition is precisely what allows skills to develop. Tradition preserves successful repetition. You learn not only what to do, you learn when to do it, how quickly, in what order, with what level of care. The details accumulate. Eventually the process becomes second nature. Your hands know what to do before you consciously think about it. Many medieval workers spent their entire lives refining a relatively narrow set of skills. Modern societies often celebrate variety. People change careers, move locations, learn new specialties. Medieval life generally offered fewer opportunities for dramatic shifts. Instead, depth frequently replaced breadth. People became deeply familiar with particular tasks because they performed them repeatedly across decades. Imagine a blacksmith working in the same community for many years, season after season, winter after winter. The faces around him change gradually. Children grow into adults. Adults become elders. Yet the essential work continues. Tools require maintenance. Metal requires shaping. The needs of the village remain remarkably consistent. This consistency reinforces traditional methods. If a process works, people keep using it. If a process fails repeatedly, it may disappear. Over time, customs emerge from countless practical decisions. The result is a body of knowledge refined through experience. Of course, medieval people were not incapable of innovation. New ideas certainly appeared. Technologies evolved. Tools improved. Techniques changed. History is filled with examples of adaptation. Yet change often arrived gradually rather than suddenly. Communities tended to evaluate new ideas carefully. A method that had survived generations possessed credibility. A new method needed to earn it. Imagine an experienced farmer hearing about a different planting technique used elsewhere. The farmer does not automatically reject the idea, but neither does he immediately abandon established practices. He compares, observes, considers. The old method has history behind it. The new method has uncertainty behind it. The new method has uncertainty behind it. Tradition and innovation coexist, but tradition usually begins with an advantage. This cautious approach makes sense when viewed through the lens of survival. Reliability often matters more than novelty. A predictable harvest is valuable. A reliable roof is valuable. A dependable tool is valuable. The medieval world frequently rewarded consistency, and consistency naturally strengthens tradition. You can see this process clearly in apprenticeships. Throughout many medieval communities, young people learned trades by working alongside experienced practitioners. The relationship extended beyond technical instruction. Apprentices absorbed habits, routines, standards, expectations. The craft itself became inseparable from its traditions. Imagine a young apprentice entering a workshop for the first time. Everything feels unfamiliar. The sounds, the smells, the tools, the pace of work. At first, the apprentice mostly observes, watching, listening, learning. Gradually, simple tasks are assigned, then more complicated ones. Months become years. Knowledge accumulates, not through lectures, through participation. Much as children learn family customs, apprentices learn work customs. And once again, repetition becomes the teacher. The same tasks performed hundreds of times. The same techniques practiced until they feel natural. Eventually, the apprentice becomes the experienced worker. The cycle continues. One generation passes knowledge to the next. The next generation preserves it. The tradition survives. There is something deeply comforting about this continuity. Imagine standing in a workshop where methods have remained familiar for decades, perhaps even centuries. The world outside may change slowly. Seasons continue turning. People come and go. Yet the work possesses a reassuring stability. You know what tomorrow will likely require. You know what next week will likely require. You know how to meet those requirements. The certainty is limited, but it exists. And certainty, even in small amounts, is valuable, especially in uncertain times. As evening approaches, the day's labor gradually ends. Tools are cleaned and stored. Materials are organized. The workshop grows quiet. Outside, shadows lengthen across fields and roads. The village settles toward another night. Tomorrow, many of the same tasks will return. Not because people lack imagination, not because change is impossible, but because tradition continues providing a dependable framework for daily work. The methods inherited from parents and grandparents have survived for a reason. They have been tested, refined, repeated, trusted, and in the medieval world, trust often mattered more than novelty. The future always contained unknowns. The weather could change. Harvests could vary. Fortunes could shift. Yet when people picked up familiar tools and followed familiar routines, they carried something valuable with them. The accumulated experience of generations. Knowledge shaped by countless ordinary days. Knowledge preserved through repetition. Knowledge passed carefully from hand to hand. And for many medieval workers, that inheritance guided daily decisions just as surely as any written instruction ever could. If the workshop was where skills were preserved, the marketplace was where those skills met the wider world. In medieval life, markets were not just places of exchange. They were also places of rhythm, places of expectation, places where tradition quietly organized behavior in ways that made trade possible at all. Imagine walking toward a village market on a cool morning. The sun is still low. Mist lingers over open ground. You can already hear activity before you see it clearly. Voices, animals, wooden carts moving over uneven paths. The soft clatter of goods being arranged. There is a sense of movement, but not chaos. Everything feels familiar, almost rehearsed. Because for many medieval communities, market days followed patterns that repeated again and again. Certain days of the week, certain locations, certain expectations about how trade should proceed. You are not entering an unknown space. You are entering a known system. And that system is held together by tradition. Stalls are arranged in familiar ways. Regular sellers occupy familiar places. Regular buyers arrive with familiar intentions. Even without formal planning, people know where to go and who to look for. This predictability is not accidental. It develops over time. A seller who consistently appears in the same place becomes easier to find. A buyer who arrives at the same time becomes easier to anticipate. A pattern forms, and that pattern becomes tradition. In a world without digital records or centralized advertising, reputation becomes essential. People rely on memory, on observation, on repeated interactions. A good seller is remembered. A reliable buyer is remembered. A fair exchange is remembered. And memory becomes a form of currency in itself. Imagine standing beside a stall where grain is being measured. The seller uses familiar containers. The buyer watches carefully, not because mistrust is constant, but because fairness depends upon shared understanding. Tradition provides that understanding. It defines how goods are measured, how transactions proceed, how disagreements are resolved. These expectations reduce uncertainty. Everyone knows the general rules, even if they are not written down in one place. And because everyone knows them, trade becomes possible even in a relatively simple economy. Now imagine a traveler arriving from another region. Their customs may differ slightly. Their measures may not match local expectations. Their goods may be unfamiliar. At first, there is careful observation. Questions are asked. Comparisons are made. Trust is not immediate. It develops through interaction. This process reveals something important about medieval markets. They are not only economic systems, they are also social systems. Trade depends upon relationships, and relationships depend upon trust. Tradition helps bridge the gap between strangers. It provides shared expectations that allow exchange to occur without constant negotiation. You might notice that medieval markets often feel less like impersonal transactions and more like recurring meetings. The same faces appear regularly. The same conversations repeat. The same jokes are exchanged. The same concerns are discussed. Over time, familiarity reduces tension. People know each other's habits. They know who is reliable. They know who is cautious. They know who is generous. And they know who is generous. And they know who requires careful attention. This knowledge does not appear instantly. It develops through repetition, through shared experience across many market days. Imagine a young person visiting the market for the first time alone. At first, everything feels slightly overwhelming. The number of voices, the variety of goods, the movement of people. But over time, patterns become clear. Certain stalls always appear in the same places. Certain sellers always call out in familiar ways. Certain transactions always follow similar steps. Gradually, the marketplace becomes readable, not because it becomes simpler, but because tradition provides structure. There are also times when markets reflect broader seasonal traditions. After harvest, markets may feel fuller. After winter, goods may be scarcer. Certain products appear only at specific times of year. People learn to expect these cycles. They organize their purchasing accordingly. A good year brings abundance. A poor year brings caution, and everyone adjusts. This adjustment is not always formal. It is often instinctive, shaped by memory, shaped by experience, shaped by tradition repeated across generations. Even pricing is influenced by expectation. While exact values vary, people develop a general sense of fairness based on past interactions. If something feels too expensive, hesitation appears. If something feels unusually cheap, suspicion may arise. Not necessarily because people are distrustful, but because experience teaches them what is normal, and tradition defines that normality. Imagine a quiet negotiation at a stall as the morning continues. The conversation is calm, measured. There is no urgency, no pressure beyond the natural rhythm of market life. The buyer considers, the seller responds. Small adjustments are made. Eventually an agreement is reached. This process may seem simple, but it depends on shared cultural understanding. Without that understanding, every exchange would require lengthy explanation. Tradition saves time by reducing the need for constant negotiation. People already know the general expectations, so they can focus on the exchange itself. As the day progresses, the market slowly changes. Early morning energy gives way to steady flow. Later, activity begins to decline. Goods are packed away. Stalls are dismantled. Paths grow quieter again. The market leaves behind traces of its presence, but the rhythm remains familiar. Next time it will happen again in much the same way. And this repetition is essential, because repetition builds trust. Trust builds cooperation. Cooperation allows trade to function. There's also a subtle emotional dimension to markets. They are not only places of necessity, they are also places of connection. People hear news. They exchange stories. They observe changes in neighboring communities. Information spreads through conversation rather than formal systems. A market is, in a sense, a network made visible, and tradition helps regulate that network. It determines behavior. It shapes expectations. It provides stability in a space filled with movement. Without these shared customs, markets would feel unpredictable, difficult to navigate, harder to trust. But with them, even strangers can engage in meaningful exchange. As the sun begins to lower in the sky, the final transactions take place. The last goods are gathered. The final conversations are spoken, and slowly the market dissolves back into ordinary space. Yet its influence remains, because the relationships formed there continue beyond a single day. They carry forward into the next meeting, and the next, and the next. In this way, medieval market traditions are not limited to commerce. They are part of a larger system of repeated human interaction, a system built on memory, on habit, on expectation, on trust slowly accumulated over time. And like so many other aspects of medieval life, they show that even simple daily decisions were rarely made in isolation. They were guided by patterns established long before any individual arrived, patterns that shaped how people bought, sold, and interacted, patterns that quietly turned uncertainty into something slightly more manageable. By now you may have noticed something subtle running beneath almost every part of medieval life. Seasonal rhythms shaped work. Religious calendars shaped time. Family shaped identity. Neighbors shaped survival. Markets shaped exchange. And in the middle of all these structured systems there existed something quieter, more personal, more uncertain, more difficult to define. Everyday superstition. It is easy to misunderstand this word from a modern perspective. Superstition can sound like something irrational or foolish, but in the medieval world it often existed in a much softer form, not as strict belief, not as rigid doctrine, but as habit, comfort, caution, and inherited caution in particular can become deeply embedded in daily life. Imagine yourself waking early in a medieval household. The morning is still dim. The air inside the home is cool. A faint glow from the hearth begins to grow as someone tends the fire. Before any work begins outside, small routines already start inside. Simple actions, quiet actions, familiar actions. Some of these actions have practical purposes. Others carry meanings that are less easy to explain. For example, a person might avoid beginning certain tasks on particular days, not because the day is officially forbidden, but because experience or tradition suggests it may be unwise. Someone might knock on wood after speaking about good fortune, not as a formal rule, but as a gesture of caution passed through generations. A traveler might pause briefly before a journey, observing small rituals of preparation. A farmer might choose a particular moment to begin planting, even if another moment seems equally suitable. These actions exist in the space between belief and habit, between reason and memory, between personal choice and inherited expectation. And in medieval life that space is large, because uncertainty is large. When outcomes are unpredictable, people often look for patterns that help them feel slightly more in control, even if those patterns are symbolic rather than scientific. Imagine standing beside a field just before planting begins. The soil is ready, the tools are prepared, the weather seems acceptable, and yet before work begins, there may be small pauses, moments of hesitation, moments of ritualized action, perhaps a brief prayer, perhaps a traditional gesture, perhaps a quiet observation of surroundings. None of these actions guarantee success, but they create a sense of readiness, a psychological preparation for uncertainty. And in a world where uncertainty is constant, that preparation matters. You may begin to see how superstition is often less about fear and more about structure. It helps organize decisions that would otherwise feel completely open-ended. If every outcome depends on unknown forces, weather, illness, harvest conditions, trade fluctuations, then small rituals provide emotional anchors. They do not change the world, but they change how people approach the world. Now imagine a long winter evening inside a village home. Outside, darkness has fully settled. Wind moves across empty fields. Inside, the family gathers near firelight. Conversation is slow and steady. Stories are shared, tasks are completed, and small habits continue. Someone may place an object in a particular position for good fortune. Someone may avoid speaking certain words at certain times. Someone may interpret a dream as meaningful in some way. These interpretations do not always follow consistent logic, yet they persist because they connect personal experience to a larger sense of meaning. In medieval life, meaning is rarely separated from daily action. Even simple routines can carry symbolic weight, and because tradition is powerful, symbolic habits often pass from one generation to the next. A child watching an adult perform a small ritual may not fully understand it, but they remember it, and later they repeat it, not always consciously, sometimes automatically. This is how many customs survive, not through formal instruction, but through observation. Consider the way people respond to unusual events: a sudden storm during harvest, an unexpected illness, a strangely timed animal behavior, a dream that feels vivid or unsettling. In such moments, people often seek explanation, and tradition frequently provides a framework for interpretation. Some explanations are practical, others are symbolic, some are rooted in long experience, others are rooted in all experience, others are rooted in older stories whose origins are no longer clear. Yet all of them serve a similar purpose. They reduce uncertainty. They transform random events into something that feels more understandable. Even if the explanation is not scientifically accurate, it still provides psychological order. Imagine a small group of villagers discussing an unusual occurrence. The conversation is calm, thoughtful. People recall past experiences. They compare memories. They suggest possible meanings. No single explanation dominates immediately. Instead, understanding forms gradually through shared reflection. This collective interpretation is an important feature of medieval life. Meaning is often created socially, not individually, and once a shared interpretation becomes established, it can turn into tradition. Over time, that tradition may influence behavior. For example, certain actions might be avoided after specific experiences, or certain practices might be repeated because they are believed to bring stability. These patterns become part of everyday life without needing formal rules. You may notice that superstition often overlaps with religion, observation, and habit. The boundaries between these categories are not always clear. A prayer might be both religious and habitual. A gesture might be both cultural and symbolic. A belief might be both practical and inherited. In the medieval world, these layers often coexist without strict separation. Now imagine walking through a village during early spring. The air is still cool. The ground is beginning to soften. Birds are returning. Work is preparing to begin again. People move with a mixture of anticipation and caution. Some carry out small traditional actions before starting important tasks, not because they expect magic, but because tradition provides reassurance, a sense of continuity, a connection to those who performed the same actions before them. This continuity is deeply important. It reminds people that they are not making decisions alone. They are participating in a long chain of experience stretching backward through generations. Even uncertainty feels slightly more manageable when shared with the past. As the day continues, work resumes. The rituals fade into the background, but their influence remains. They have already shaped the mindset with which the work begins, and that is often enough. Because in many cases, medieval traditions are not about changing outcomes directly. They are about shaping the way people face uncertainty. They encourage caution, attention, reflection, and continuity. In a world where so much lies beyond control, these qualities matter. As evening approaches once again, and the village settles into its familiar rhythm of firelight and shadow, the small rituals of the day are already becoming memory. But tomorrow, they may return. Slightly altered, repeated, passed on, and slowly, like so many other traditions, they become part of the invisible structure guiding daily life. Not loudly, not forcefully, but steadily. Like everything else in this world shaped by tradition, at a certain point in medieval life, tradition stops feeling like something you follow. It starts feeling like something that simply is. Not a rule, not a system, not even a decision. Just the natural shape of the world you live inside. When every generation around you behaves in similar ways, the mind rarely stops to ask why. The question itself feels unnecessary. Imagine waking in a village where nearly everything around you has already been organized by habits older than memory. The path to the fields is always taken the same way. The work of the day begins in familiar sequences. Meals appear at familiar times. Greetings follow familiar forms. Even silence has familiar places in the day. You do not need to constantly decide how to behave. Much of it has already been decided through repetition. Not by one person, not by one moment, but by countless small choices made over generations until they hardened into expectation. A child growing up in this environment does not experience tradition as tradition. There is no sense of stepping into something constructed. There is only the sense of living normally. Only later, if they ever travel or encounter different customs, do they begin to notice that things could have been otherwise. But in their home village, alternatives are rarely visible. And what is not visible is rarely questioned. This is one of the quiet powers of tradition. It does not demand obedience. It simply defines what feels ordinary. Now imagine yourself walking through such a village during a calm afternoon. The sky is pale and steady. The air carries the faint scent of fields and smoke. People move slowly between tasks. Not hurried, not idle, just continuous. You pass a group repairing tools. You pass another preparing food. You pass others tending animals or organizing materials for later work. Nothing feels unusual. Everything feels expected. And expectation is often stronger than instruction. A person does not need to be told what to do when the pattern of life already suggests. Yet this is how many medieval customs survive without being written down in formal ways. They exist in the space between action and repetition. You learn them by being present, by watching others, by imitating, by participating. There is rarely a moment where someone stops and explains the entire system. Instead, you absorb it gradually, like weather shaping stone over long periods. One of the most striking aspects of this process is how invisible it becomes to those inside it. People rarely think of their own customs as customs. They think of them as common sense, as the way things are done, as the natural order of life. Only when encountering outsiders or unusual circumstances does the structure become visible. A traveler from another region might perform a task differently. A visiting merchant might use unfamiliar methods. A neighboring village might observe different habits. These differences can be noticed, but even then, they are often interpreted through the lens of one's own tradition. What feels unfamiliar is sometimes seen as incorrect, strange, or simply not how things are done. This reaction is not necessarily hostility. It is stability. The mind uses familiar patterns as reference points. In a world where survival depends on predictability, this preference for the known becomes deeply rooted. Imagine sitting near a hearth in the evening. The fire burns steadily. Shadows move gently along the walls. Someone is speaking softly about events of the day. The conversation is ordinary. There is no urgency, no dramatic conclusion, just the slow passing of time. And within that conversation, tradition is present even if no one names it. A comment about how things are usually done, a reference to how they were done in the past, a quiet expectation about what should happen next. These small references reinforce continuity. They connect the present moment to earlier ones, and they help maintain the sense that life follows a recognizable path. You might notice that medieval traditions often rely less on strict enforcement and more on shared recognition. People comply not because someone is watching them at every moment, but because they share an understanding of what behavior belongs where. That shared understanding is powerful. It reduces the need for constant explanation. It allows social life to function smoothly, and it creates a sense of predictability that is deeply valuable in uncertain times. Now imagine a young person reaching adulthood in such a world. They have grown up surrounded by repetition. They have learned skills through imitation. They have absorbed expectations through observation. When they begin to make independent decisions, they often do so within a framework already shaped by tradition. Even personal choices feel guided, not because freedom is absent, but because the boundaries of possibility are already familiar. This familiarity can feel reassuring. There is less ambiguity, less pressure to invent entirely new paths. The path forward is usually already visible, even if it is not formally described. At the same time, tradition does not eliminate individuality. People still make choices. They still differ in personality, temperament, skill, and preference. But those differences exist within a shared structure, like variations within a familiar landscape. Fields may differ slightly, houses may differ in detail, families may differ in habits, yet the broader pattern remains consistent. This balance between continuity and variation is part of what allows medieval communities to persist across long periods of time. Tradition provides stability. Individuals provide variation. Together they create a living system that slowly adapts while maintaining coherence. As the day moves toward evening in the village, routines begin to settle. Work slows, tools are put away, people return to their homes. Smoke rises into the cooling air. The rhythm of the day closes in a familiar way. Nothing about it feels surprising. And that lack of surprise is itself a product of tradition, because when actions repeat often enough, they stop appearing as choices. They appear as the structure of life itself. And so, without being loudly noticed, tradition continues shaping every part of the day, not through force, not through command, but through familiarity. The kind of familiarity that becomes invisible only because it is everywhere. Not every medieval decision followed tradition without question. Even in a world where custom shaped much of daily life, there were always moments when someone stepped slightly outside the familiar pattern. Sometimes this happened by necessity, sometimes by curiosity, sometimes by disagreement, and sometimes simply because life does not always allow people to follow what is expected. But stepping outside tradition was rarely a neutral act. It had consequences, not always dramatic ones, not always immediate ones, but consequences that unfolded quietly over time, within the close-knit structure of village life. Imagine yourself in a medieval village where most people behave in familiar ways. The seasons are followed, the calendar is respected, family expectations are understood, neighborly obligations are shared, markets operate through established habits, and daily work proceeds through inherited routines. In such a world, tradition acts like a shared language. Everyone understands its basic grammar. Everyone recognizes its patterns. When someone chooses not to follow that language, others notice. At first, the reaction is usually subtle. A pause in conversation, a glance, a quiet comment. Not open confrontation, not immediate exclusion, but observation, because in a small community, deviation is visible. Now imagine a person deciding to plant crops earlier than the customary time. Perhaps they believe the weather is favorable. Perhaps they have observed something others have not. Perhaps they simply prefer to act differently. At first the decision may seem harmless, one household making one choice, but others will watch, they will remember, they will compare the outcome to traditional timing. If the harvest succeeds, the memory of that success may linger. If it fails, the memory may linger even more strongly. Human memory often weighs negative outcomes heavily when traditions are involved, not because people are unfair, but because survival depends on caution. A failed experiment in agriculture is not just an idea that did not work. It can mean scarcity, it can mean hunger, it can affect the entire community. And so tradition becomes reinforced by caution. Now imagine someone ignoring a local expectation regarding communal work. Perhaps they do not participate in a shared task. Perhaps they contribute less than expected. Perhaps they decline repeatedly. At first, neighbors may assume there is a valid reason: illness, difficulty, temporary hardship. But over time, if the pattern continues, interpretation begins to shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but gradually. People begin to adjust how they relate to that person. Requests for help may become less frequent. Trust may become slightly more cautious. Cooperation may become less immediate. Again, this is rarely formal punishment. It is social memory, a record formed through repeated observation. In a medieval village, reputation is not written in documents. It is written in people's minds. And because people rely on one another, reputation matters deeply. Now consider a more sensitive example: ritual or religious custom. Certain days may be expected for rest or observance. Certain behaviors may be encouraged or discouraged. Someone who repeatedly ignores these expectations may not face immediate consequences, but they may be seen as unusual, or unpredictable, or disconnected from shared norms, and unpredictability is often treated carefully in small communities, not because difference is always unwelcome, but because coordination depends on shared understanding. When expectations diverge too far, coordination becomes harder. Still, it is important not to imagine medieval society as rigid or unchanging. People did question traditions. People did adapt customs over time. Entire practices slowly evolved across generations. But change in this world is usually gradual rather than sudden. It rarely appears as a single act of defiance. Instead, it emerges through repetition of small deviations that eventually become new patterns. Imagine a craft technique used slightly differently by one skilled worker. At first, others may view it as unusual, but if the result proves useful, it may be imitated. Over time, what was once deviation can become accepted practice. This is how many traditions quietly evolve, not through rejection, but through slow adjustment. Now return to the village perspective. A person who consistently ignores tradition does not immediately become an outsider, but they exist in a slightly different social space. Their actions are less predictable. Their behavior requires more attention from others. And in a world where cooperation is essential, predictability is valuable. So tradition becomes a kind of social anchor. It helps maintain trust. It reduces uncertainty. It allows people to coordinate their lives without constant negotiation. When someone steps away from that anchor, even slightly, the surrounding system adjusts, not always harshly, but carefully. Like a group adapting to a change in rhythm, you can also imagine situations where ignoring tradition leads not to conflict but to isolation of experience. A person experimenting with unfamiliar methods may discover something useful, but if others do not adopt it, that knowledge may remain limited. Innovation without adoption can remain private. In a world without fast communication networks, ideas spread slowly. So even successful deviations may take years or generations to become widely accepted. This delay reinforces the importance of tradition as a default guide. It represents the accumulated experience of many people over time. Choosing to ignore it means stepping away from that accumulated certainty, and stepping into uncertainty alone. Still, medieval life is not a simple story of conformity. There are always tensions between old and new, between custom and change, between inherited wisdom and personal observation. These tensions exist quietly in the background of daily life. A farmer comparing his own results with traditional advice, a craftsman adjusting a technique based on experience, a family slowly modifying household habits across generations. Each small change may seem insignificant, but together they shape long-term evolution of society. So when someone ignores tradition in medieval life, the outcome is not always punishment. Sometimes it is simply difference. Sometimes curiosity leads to improvement. Sometimes caution leads others to ignore change. And sometimes the result is uncertainty that resolves only over time. What remains consistent is the presence of tradition as a reference point. Even those who step away from it are still measured against it. It remains the background against which decisions are understood. As evening falls once again over the village, life returns to its familiar rhythm. Work ends. Homes fill with light. Conversations resume in quiet tones, and the events of the day, whether traditional or not, settle into memory. Tomorrow, most people will return to familiar patterns, not necessarily because they were forced, but because those patterns have proven reliable, and reliability in this world is often more persuasive than novelty. By this point, it becomes easier to see tradition not as a collection of old habits, but as something closer to a survival system, not written, not designed, but built slowly over time through repetition, correction, and memory. In a medieval world where nearly every resource depended on timing, cooperation, and experience, tradition functioned almost like an invisible technology, not mechanical, not visible in the modern sense, but deeply practical. Imagine yourself standing in the middle of an ordinary village morning. Nothing appears especially remarkable. People are moving through familiar tasks. Smoke rises from chimneys. Animals are being guided to feed. Tools are being collected. And yet behind every action there is a layer of inherited knowledge guiding what happens next. You do not need to calculate everything from the beginning. You do not need to test every possibility. You do not need to rediscover methods each day. Instead, you rely on patterns already proven. This is what tradition provides: a shortcut through uncertainty, a map drawn by generations who already faced similar conditions. Now imagine what life would feel like without this map. Every decision would require evaluation. Every task would require experimentation. Every season would require guesswork. How deep should seeds be planted? When should animals be moved? How should food be preserved? How should tools be repaired? Without tradition, each question becomes heavier, not impossible to answer, but slower, more uncertain, more costly in time and risk. Tradition reduces that burden. It does not eliminate difficulty, but it lowers the cognitive weight of daily life. It allows people to act without constant hesitation. And in a world where time, labor, and survival are tightly linked, this reduction matters greatly. Imagine a farmer preparing for planting season. The soil has been worked before. The weather is watched carefully. But instead of starting from nothing, the farmer recalls what previous years have taught. What worked, what failed, what conditions usually lead to success. These memories are not stored in books. They are stored in people, in conversations, in observation, in repeated action. The farmer does not need to reconstruct knowledge. It is already present, embedded in experience. This is why medieval traditions often feel so stable. They are not held together by authority alone. They are held together by results. If something consistently works, it is repeated. If something consistently fails, it is abandoned. Over time, this creates a body of practice that feels almost natural. But it is actually the outcome of countless adjustments across generations. Now consider how this applies to community survival. A single household can survive short-term difficulties, but longer-term stability requires coordination, harvest timing, water access, animal grazing, shared labor, resource distribution. Each of these areas benefits from predictable behavior. If everyone follows different methods, coordination becomes difficult. But if everyone follows broadly similar traditions, cooperation becomes easier. This is one reason tradition spreads so effectively in small communities. It aligns individual behavior with collective needs, not through enforcement alone, but through shared experience. Imagine a village recovering after a difficult winter. Food supplies are limited. Work must be organized carefully. People rely more heavily on one another than usual. In such moments, tradition becomes especially visible. People fall back on familiar systems. Who helps whom? How tasks are divided? When work begins? How resources are shared? These patterns may have developed slowly over generations, but in moments of stress they become essential. They prevent confusion. They reduce conflict. They allow limited resources to be managed with minimal delay. Even rituals that may seem symbolic carry practical value in this sense. They create predictability in emotionally uncertain times. A known action, a known sequence, a known expectation. This predictability helps stabilize group behavior. Now imagine that same village during a more stable year. Food is sufficient, weather is moderate, work is steady. Even in these calmer conditions, tradition continues to operate in the background, not urgently, not visibly, but consistently. It shapes how people begin their day, how they interact, how they plan ahead, and how they interpret small changes in environment. You might begin to see tradition not as a response to crisis, but as a constant operating system, running quietly beneath daily life, rarely noticed, but always active. Even innovation often travels through this system. A new tool or method does not simply replace old ones overnight. It must pass through observation, trial, acceptance, and repetition. Only then does it become part of tradition itself. In this way, tradition is not opposed to change. It is the mechanism through which change becomes stable. Without it, new ideas would remain isolated. With it, they become shared knowledge. Now imagine an elder in the village observing younger generations. They may notice small differences in behavior, slight adjustments in technique, minor shifts in timing or approach. Some of these changes will be temporary, others will persist. And over time, the elder recognizes something important. Tradition is not static. It is continuously rewritten, but slowly enough that it feels unchanging to those inside it. This slow transformation is part of what gives tradition its strength. It does not break easily. It adapts gradually, like a river carving its path through land over centuries. As evening approaches again, and the village settles into its familiar rhythm of rest, the idea of tradition as survival technology becomes clearer. It is not a tool in the modern sense. It is not built or installed. It is lived, reinforced daily through repetition, strengthened through memory, and passed forward through participation. Every generation receives it. Every generation adjusts it. Every generation depends on it. And in this quiet continuity, medieval life maintains its structure. Not through perfection, but through persistence. By the time you reach the end of these traditions, something subtle has happened in the way you might now imagine medieval life. Not a single moment of realization, not a subtle shift, but a slow accumulation of understanding that many of the decisions we think of as personal were, in this world, already shaped long before the moment of choice ever arrived. Not fully determined, not fully controlled, but gently guided by family, by neighbors, by seasons, by work, by memory, and by the steady repetition of customs that rarely announce themselves as customs at all. In the medieval world you have walked through, choice does not disappear. It simply becomes quieter, less dramatic, less visible. It lives inside structures that already exist. You can still decide how carefully to work, how kindly to speak, how much effort to give, how to respond to hardship. But even these decisions unfold inside a frame that has been shaped by generations who lived before you. Imagine, for a final time, a village at the end of a long day. The light is fading. Smoke rises slowly from scattered homes. The fields rest under a dim sky. People move less now. Voices become softer. Work has ended. And what remains is the quiet continuity of life preparing to repeat itself again tomorrow. A repetition not felt as monotony, but as stability, as structure, as something known. In this stillness, tradition is not something you think about. It is something you inhabit. The way doors are closed, the way food is shared, the way greetings are given, the way silence settles into the evening, all of it shaped by patterns older than memory. And in that sense, the medieval world is not distant in the way it might first appear. It is simply built on a different relationship between time and choice. Where modern life often emphasizes individual direction, medieval life often emphasizes continuity, not because people lacked individuality, but because survival favored systems that could endure beyond a single lifetime. Now, as you imagine stepping away from this world, there is no dramatic departure, no final moment of resolution, only the sense that life continues as it always has, one day following another, one generation following the next. traditions shifting slowly, almost imperceptibly, as they move forward, and perhaps that is the most important, quiet truth beneath everything you have heard, that most of human life, across time, has been lived not in moments of change, but in the space between them, in repetition, in routine, in inherited behavior, and choices that feel small, but add up over centuries into entire ways of living. And now, as the firelight fades in the imagination of this village, there is nothing urgent left to conclude, only the steady rhythm of life continuing somewhere beyond the edge of what is being described, as it always has, and as it will